A superhuman is someone who is self-aware and who cultivates their natural self. Each one of us are gifted with our unique observations, inclinations, and curiosities in life. The goal of the Superhuman Project is to help professionals become the best version of themselves and realize their full potential, to honor our natural selves. In each episode, I invite professionals at the top of their field and ask them questions about their quest for self-awareness. What makes them successful and how do they stay at the top of their game? Ultimately, it is about living a life we always wanted to live and not letting other people define it for us. Making sure we fulfill the potential that God has given us and we are living our best selves. Let's jump in. Today we have Vanessa Liu, head of SAP IO Foundries in North America. And I'll let Vanessa talk about SAP IO, which is SAP Accelerator for business-to-business enterprise startups. But the interesting fact about Vanessa is she's a builder and she has started 6 businesses in the last 20 years. She had her own venture fund called Digital Media Ventures, and she focuses on underrepresented founders, women and people of color, and she reads a lot and she's always looking at the next wave of opportunity. So thank you, Vanessa, for your time today. And I know that you are right now in France. So what's the time there right now?
So it's about it's 6 hours ahead of East Coast time. So it's 9:11 p.m.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for giving us time in the night. So cool.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start this conversation. So Vanessa, why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yes, well, thank you so much. So I, as you so succinctly put it, have always been interested in innovation. I first started off my career at McKinsey, where I was helping our clients build digital media businesses. So I was doing that again and again and again, where I would go in, we would craft the business plan, but not only that, would implement the first basically sprouts of a business and then hand it back to the clients to run. So this included ideas like a free internet service provider for the Dutch market, a new combined merged newspaper for also the Dutch market, a new website for these golf and motorcycle enthusiasts in the UK. This is something I did again and again. I loved it. And towards the end of my time at McKinsey, I realized that I wanted to actually be the person who would run the businesses full time. I didn't want to give the businesses back anymore. So that's when I realized I had that itch. So I teamed up with a business partner, and we founded Trigger Media Group, which was a venture startup studio. The whole idea was that we were going to build businesses that were our own ideas. So we launched a couple of businesses there. One called InsideHook, which is still going strong, though it now has a new owner. And the second company is called Fevo, which powers the group ticketing for about 75% of the professional sports teams in the US. So I was the CEO in the early days of both companies, getting it through its inception, through the MVP to product market fit, and then we found long-term CEOs to run the businesses. And it was about this time after we had deployed all of our capital into these 2 businesses that I thought, you know what, I've seen such a disparity in the funding market for underrepresented founders, where it's really tough for them to get funding. It's really because of a lack of access to networks. So I really wanted to do something in that field. And I was also really interested in what was going on in enterprise tech. And the last 3 years, that's what I've been doing. I got recruited to SAP to oversee our SAP IO activities. SAP IO is our early stage accelerator. We run accelerator programs in 9 locations around the world. And this is to find startups to bring into the SAP ecosystem. And while it's a focus on enterprise tech, what we also do is we are committed to to working with underrepresented founders. At least 40% of the startups that we work with are led by underrepresented founders. And our New York programs have traditionally been 100% focused on that. So we're able to really think about what this next generation ecosystem could be for SAP's over 400,000 customers.
Wow, wow. This is amazing. I mean, I'm just taking notes here, and looks like you have touched business from all angles. You started with curating businesses and handing over, and then you said you moved into owning your own business, and then you started funding businesses, and now you are incubating or helping these startups accelerate and using the SAP ecosystem. So you have touched almost all stages of the life cycle of, I would say, from idea to a revenue generating business. And
yes, definitely.
And something I read on your profile, it talks about your expertise is growth, which got my attention. And everybody loves growth. So how do you define that? And why do you say your expertise is growth?
So, maybe this harkens back to my McKinsey days where, you have to earn the right to grow. And if you don't grow, then you have to exit the market. Like this whole notion of grow or go is something that you see in all of the best performing or worst performing companies around us. Like there have been so many studies that talk about the need for growth. It's the imperative for growth. That's the only way you're going to survive. And so this is something that I honed early on. It's not enough to just get something up and running. You have to think very systematically, what are the levers to push on so that you can prioritize where you're going to spend your resources. And then from there, get as much of the return on the investment in a short period of time as possible. So how can you keep on 10xing a business? It's that type of relentless focus that I was really lucky to have gotten a lot of schooling on when I was at McKinsey, of course, with more established companies. And then thinking about the startup ecosystem, I mean, the companies that we work with are anywhere between late seed and Series C companies. So these are companies that are all in the beginning or right in the middle of their hockey stick of growth. They've been at it for a while, but it's thinking about those strategic moves that you can make so that growth can really just be something that is not accidental, but it's purposeful.
This is very intriguing to me. So let's talk about the strategic moves, because I always think in my mind, like you mentioned, startups go through the stages, pre-seed and then Series A through X. At every stage, there is an expectation of growth. It could be in terms of number of customers, in terms of revenue. There are different metrics around that. So like you mentioned that you learned something at McKinsey which taught you how to consistently grow business at a particular rate. So could you give some examples of like these strategic moves, just to add some color to different ways of keeping companies or businesses growing?
Yes. So, let me take you back to the time when I was a founder. So this was after my time at McKinsey. And, of course, I had been schooled in terms of working with very large corporates when I was at McKinsey. But I also saw just, how nimble you are when you are an early stage company, the types of decision making that you can have. So our first business, InsideHook, was a digital media platform based primarily on email to reach that affluent male demographic between 30 and 55. So this was a segment that had been underserved. If you think about the media landscape, where do you find these individuals? It's actually quite hard because they're typically professionals. They are really strapped for time. They are avid news readers, so are probably behind a Bloomberg terminal. But when it comes to, being able to reach them in a meaningful way, because they're so pressed for time, there were very few outlets that were really catering to them. We could have done what we did which was publish incredible articles and just hope and pray that by word of mouth, we would be able to grow quickly. But we knew that that would not be enough. The only that we saw to decrease our cost per acquisition was to strike meaningful partnerships with existing media companies so that we could really push the email membership drive. So early on, we were super lucky that one of our investors was Advanced Publications, which owns the Condé Nast magazines. And by working together with them, we saw that they were reaching, a lot of this demographic through some of their titles. So to be able to work with them so that they could introduce InsideHook to their audience gave us that leg up that many other startups don't have. So it's thinking about that strategic lens. Can I strike a partnership with a corporate? The whole, for me, the whole corporate startup side has been my specialty just because of the training that I've received. And it also made me realize why when I got approached by SAP, I saw that that was like a really great opportunity to build out a platform for startups. If you can plug into existing SAP products and platforms where you can be turned on a flip of a switch and then get access to SAP's network of customers, then that means that you have an additional field force working on your behalf. That is the type of strategic move that I've been working a lot with our founders about.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So moving on to I'll take the concept of growth and we'll try to apply it to individuals instead of just businesses or companies. So as the goal of the Superhuman Project is to empower every individual towards self-mastery, self-awareness, and living their full potential. So what's your advice or what is your approach to self-growth? Like you talk about, I call it, growth hacking for a business where you are forming these alliances to take advantage of your partners or their scale. So likewise, let's say in individuals for their professional careers or in their lives, do you have the same approach? And if yes, how do you do that?
I wish I could say I'm as organized in my personal life as I am in my professional life. I'm actually much more intuition and also serendipity based when it comes to my personal life. I feel like actually that allows for collisions to happen, which you normally wouldn't think of. And because it's so people driven, right? And you really there are beautiful things that happen if you allow serendipity to happen. I tend to let things go. So maybe that is my purpose, my being very purposeful in my personal life. Like I allow for that to happen. So for instance, whenever somebody reaches out and people that I know really well, and they say like, look, I just need you to meet X, Y, and Z person. I'm always the type of person to say, hey, yes, sign me up, because I know that something really interesting could come out of that. And in terms of meeting great people and just seeing what could come out of that. And I think about how you and I met through Judy Robinette, who has been a guest on your podcast. That's an example of the type of serendipity where she calls me up all the time, and we're always trading messages. And whenever she says, you have to meet this person, I automatically take that because I know that it's going to lead to something quite exciting.
You talk about something which I actually listened to your other interview on the podcast, The Main Thing. And you mentioned something that the one thing that you have learned is, if I'm quoting you right, that everything happens for a reason and allowing things to happen. And you also mentioned that you are not spiritual, but at the same time, this applies to me in terms of I'm very spiritual, and I read or follow this Chinese textbook. I don't know if you have heard about it. It's called Tao Te Ching. And being an engineer, I always looked for logic in life. and logic for how things happen, why things happen. So this book gave me a logic, and the logic is exactly what you are talking about, that allow things to happen, let go, and let things happen, and things, life becomes magical and things fall in place. But I always wonder in terms of the balance of control versus surrender. So, and especially in the professional world, in startup world, we are trying to grow, we are trying to achieve the next milestone so that we can get more bigger valuation, more funding, and all kinds of good things. So how do you define a balance between control and surrender, or allowing versus planning and deliberately, proactively reaching out, talking to people and all that?
I think it's, I wouldn't say, I'm only allowing for serendipity to happen at all times, right? It is structured.
Yeah.
If I think about the course of my work week, for instance, I allow for these types of, serendipitous interactions to happen. To know that when it comes to that you do, and then you might not have that direction anymore, it's really important to reflect on it. So I typically leave my Mondays and Fridays are the days where I allow myself a couple of hours to meet people that I just haven't spoken to before, haven't met before. And in my mind too, I always have like a roster of different projects that I'm working on. So here's an example. Outside of SAP, I happen to advise a handful of companies. And I also happen to do a lot of nonprofit work, the most meaningful being doing a lot of work for the Harvard Alumni Association. So that's my alma mater, and I'll be starting my presidency as the president of the Harvard Alumni Association this July. So there's a lot around that. And it's not just about engaging alumni, but really taking that to the next level. What can we do from a social impact perspective? So whenever I go into these discussions, these projects are percolating in my head, because I feel like that's a way of being able to give back and also affect more people. So that's how I look at it. So whenever I'm talking to people, I'm always thinking, how can I connect the dots so that we can do something really incredible together that we would not have been able to do if we were just doing our projects on our own. And inevitably, I always find that when you're open to that, other folks have projects that could be really complementary to what it is that you're doing. So that's the structure. It's a very loose structure that I put in, but at least it's not surrendering myself to anything that comes and it's laissez-faire and I get tugged, back and forth on too many angles.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Now, if I were to move on, extrapolating this concept in terms of your leadership style, how do you manage to deliver on an outcome when you are working through a team? So how do you make sure that you have a healthy balance of carrot versus stick, or what is your management style? What is it that works for you in terms of managing different types of people, different personalities, different styles of working?
Well, I've learned over the years that leadership is very different from management. I think leadership is very much about setting the direction and being able to inspire. Managing is making sure that the work gets done, right? And being able to delegate properly and to ensure that that when it comes to your resources, that you are maximizing the output and being able to give people a chance to really shine and do the best work that they can. And I mean, my style is that it's all about teams. It's all about how you work together. It's not about any one single individual contributor. I really do think that if teams work very well together, the output that you can get surpasses that of what you can do on an individual
Alone.
basis.
Yeah.
So I'm constantly looking and trying to understand what motivates people. So I tend to plot people on a skill will matrix. I'm sure you've heard of that before. So if you have like on the x-axis skill, on the y-axis will, and you plot, low, high on the x-axis and then low, high on the x-axis, how do people fit in from that skill will matrix? Because of course, like if you have a rock star who's high on skill and high on will, it's going to be a very easy management job. If it's going to be somebody who is high on skill but low on will, that's super tough, right? Like it's not something that is coachable if that person doesn't really have the will and the motivation. And then, and so on and so forth. You could just go through each of the quadrants. And I always also layer it on with personality styles. How do people work with one another? Are you an introvert or an extrovert? I do believe in the Myers-Briggs personality indicators are actually quite powerful. I don't think they're the end all be all, but they're powerful enough so that you can have good conversations as a team in terms of how you work together. So if you are structured, but I am a person who is constantly waiting until the last minute, you could see like how that could clash. If somebody is a thinker and another person is a feeler, you could see how clashes can happen, but also at the same time see how they can be complementary and provide different perspectives to problems. So I'm always of the opinion of really understanding everybody on a team and making sure everybody on the team also understands each other so that they are not only doing their own part, but understanding how they can help one another out. So that's my management style is really one of collaboration. It's really one of being able to be empathetic, but also be able to coach so that you can really just get up on the skills side. If you're not there on the will side, though, that's where we have an issue, and that's where unfortunately, where you typically have to counsel people to leave.
Got it. So let's double click on this. So I'm really intrigued by the skill will quadrant, the matrix that you're talking about. So how do you assess the skill and will for the individuals in your team? Is it like you make them go through these personality tests like Myers-Briggs, or how would you identify that? Because I think it might take some time, and when you spend time with someone and look at them in trenches or in action, you assess if they have a skill or they do have a will or not. So my question is more in terms of even before, like at the stage of hiring or when somebody new starts in your team, is there a way to plot them on that matrix? And if yes, how do you find if there are some easier ways to spot skill and will for somebody who is new to the team?
Yeah, I love how with your engineering background and trying to see if that's replicable, right? So, the Myers-Briggs personality test is just that. It's about your personality and your way of working rather than plotting you on a skill will, spectrum. I think look, skill is assessed very differently depending upon the role. And the longer you fit into in a role, the more you can define what that is. So for every role in my team, I always have a very clear idea of what like an average performer is, where an outstanding performer is, and also conversely, what an underperformer or underperformance is. Very concretely, down to not only the type of output that you should see, but how interactions should be along various dimensions. And so take for instance, like an operations person, right? I'm thinking about a startup. Like when it comes to operations, you are the engine of a startup. You are making things run. So you better be a person who is constantly following up on everything and knows how to be that spider in the web to reach out to different functions and departments to bring people together, and who can actually use the judgment to make things happen and to bring people together when something needs to be solved. So you can get very specific along those lines. When it comes to will, it's less of a, hey, there is like a spectrum. It's almost like you know it when you see it. If somebody is extremely excited about their job, are they giving it their all? Are they trying to learn? Are they also a morale booster to others? Do they actually exude energy when it comes to that particular job, right? It's less of a qualification. It's more about the attitude and also the way and the demeanor and the way that person works with others to assess will.
That's very helpful. So I'm trying to understand your hiring approach. Is there any particular question that really helps you assess the candidate for the fitment of a particular role you are hiring for? Or maybe how do you assess a candidate?
So for me, it's always about what makes that person tick. And so I'm always trying to uncover the why. Why did that person make specific decisions to go into a particular field? What motivates them? Are they self-aware enough so that they've made that reflection, just very purposefully and also very meaningfully? So I ask a lot of probing questions. So if somebody says, like, well, I made the switch from, this field to that field, I always say, why? Tell me why. Because I do think that understanding somebody's intrinsic motivations helps you uncover what that person is going to give to your particular role. And that is part of the will assessment. Like, do they really want this? Why do they want this? I hope it's beyond just a steady paycheck. It should be something more than that. It should be something purposeful, because you know that you can get the most out of people if this is something that they're truly passionate about.
So, and what's your guidance in terms of becoming self-aware or finding one's true calling? Is there a way to do that? Or what's your advice to someone, let's say your younger self, or somebody who's listening to this who just started their college education, but they do not know which direction they want to go or what kind of a job they want to do? Where can they start? What's your advice?
So my advice to my younger self would be to just try as many different things as possible. I think that college is an incredible time for that. For instance, whenever you have the opportunity to do an internship, jump at it. When you're taking a look at your career services offerings, what jumps out at you the most? Like, not thinking about it too much, but like when you're reading something, what is jumping out at you first amongst other areas? That usually is like a very good indicator of what your interest is, and to try it. So there's like the notion of trying different things. Then there's a notion of being able to get feedback from people around you. So your peers, your professors, any mentors that you have, your family members, because they always have a perspective on you that you don't have, which is an external one. What do they see you getting excited about? Sometimes it's so internalized in your head in terms of what you should be excited about versus what you're truly excited about. And sometimes you just need that feedback from others. And so asking people who know you well to say, hey, I'm thinking about X, Y, and Z. What are your thoughts? And that was the type of questioning for me that made me realize when early on, I had wanted to become an astronaut for the longest time, since I was like 13 years old till I was 21. And I loved the sciences, but I think it was when I was working in a lab in my, in basically the later years of my college years, I was talking to my professor about this. I was working in his lab, and I said, you know what, I would love to go and do a postdoc. And he said, are you sure? And this was the first time someone ever questioned me about it, because everybody always assumed, oh, that's so great, you should go and do it. And he said, like, look, I see that you get a lot of energy by being around people who are, very motivated. But are you truly motivated to come into the lab even when those people are not here? And that was a very insightful question, because he saw what was making me tick were the connections that I was making. And then secondarily, the work that I was doing. Yes, of course, I enjoyed doing the experiments, but not doing the experiments for the experiment's sake, which is what you need to have as a scientist. Mm-hmm. And so that made me realize that I had to find, basically the purpose within me to really be truthful to myself in terms of what I wanted to do.
This is so inspiring. So what's your advice to people who maybe they have been at a particular place, at a particular job for all their life, and they are not sure about their calling, and they do not have, the people around them also probably are not of much help. So what can they do in terms of finding more about themselves?
So what I find, there are a couple of things. So if the immediate people around you might not be of much help, I would stretch beyond that. I think, for instance, in this day and age of social media, of apps such as Clubhouse or LinkedIn, there's so many resources for you to be able to reach out to people digitally. And this is about finding those meaningful connections so that you can see what resonates with you. And I always tell people, look, the answer is no unless you ask. And so many people out there are so appreciative of just being asked for some advice, like a quick informational interview, being able to give back just for, like a 20-minute slot. And I would encourage you to do as many of those as possible, because I think the worst thing you could do is to look back at the end of your life and think, like, what if, or just have regrets and these notions, and that you should have or could have or would have tried something, but for the fact that you just didn't have the courage to do so. It's always about taking that first little step, and that first little step is reaching out to people that you don't know to get advice.
Great. So I had a question on this also planned. So reaching out to people, or just cold reaching out to people you do not know. How do you ensure, or how do you make sure that you receive a response? Because not everybody is interested. Like, people get thousands or hundreds of these cold reach outs. And when you are like the face of a company, or you are publicly known, you get thousands of such requests. So how do you ensure that your chances of getting a response and talking to the other person are good? How do you do that?
It's a really good question. I mean, we've all been there before, right? Where you're just like, gosh, what is going to make this person respond? And of course, you have your big question for them, but you always need to put yourself into the shoes of the other person to ask yourself, why would they be interested? What can you do to show them that this could be something as rewarding for them as well? Could it be because you're offering like insights into an area that they're interested in? Is it because you have something in common with that person? Because you share some common interest or some common shared experience, like a school that you both went to? Do your research. It's so important to do your research. And I think that, if you do enough research on the other person to understand, like, why would they help you? And you really tap into that, and you think about how you can help that person truly, chances are you'll be able to formulate something that is so intriguing that they will want to respond. This is about a two-way street.
Perfect. This is really great. So, looking at the time here, moving on, I see you mentioned that you read a lot and you are always looking for the next wave of opportunities. So what's top of the mind for you in terms of the trends, in terms of opportunities that you see around? What's catching your attention these days?
So for me, we're obviously still deep in the throes of this pandemic, and thinking about how people have been spending their time. For me, I've been thinking a lot about how elder people in our communities have been spending time, mainly because for the first 6 months of the pandemic, we were living together with my parents just to make sure that they were safe. And then when it came to the last 6 months, we've been living together. We're not together, but very close to my husband's family, so that we can help them just to be on call and to just make sure that they were okay. So this is an area which I feel like there needs to be more light shed on it, because I come from a culture where elders are revered. Like, they are a source of wisdom. They are integrated into the families. This intergenerationality is something which is like so core to at least like my culture, and I think yours is very similar as well. And if I think about, you read all of these stories over the last year, how people have been so lonely, and how they've been in homes, for instance, where they have not been able to have any human interaction beyond, the nurses that are there. And unfortunately, so many of them, especially early on, had COVID coming through these homes. You have to think that there has to be a better way to age. So I do think that this demographic shift, where now obviously the baby boomers are now going into that bulge bracket where they're going to comprise a very large segment of the 65 plus demographic. What is that going to lead to? Because they're not going to stand for it. They're thinking about what's next. They're not thinking about, hey, put me out of my community and, forget about me. There's just no way that they're going to stand for that, nor should they be. So I've been thinking a lot about that. That's one trend I've been thinking about. Another trend I've been thinking a lot about is more on the social element. I think there's just so much increasing polarization around us. So how do you bridge divides when it's very clear that talking about the facts is not enough? Anything from, if you think about our political environment in the United States, and something as simple as, are you going to take a vaccine? Yes or no? And how politicized that has become. I fear for our futures if we're all trying to solve these broad societal issues, such as the climate crisis, or thinking about how the food resources are becoming so scarce. You can't do that in silos. You have to do that together. So similar to the work I do, at least in small teams, trying to understand the psyche of everybody on a team, I also think that there should be curriculum out there to understand why this tribal mentality is happening. And I'd like to see, technology play a role to help people overcome this polarization rather than exacerbating it.
Wow, that's deep. In my mind, I was thinking, this is something that I also sometimes think about, especially, I don't know if you read this week's Economist. They talk about how the exact polarization that you're talking about, how companies are reassessing their supply chains. They are thinking if they should rely on other countries for their goods and materials, or they should start manufacturing in-house. It's scary because it's like the whole human race is taking a step back in the name of advancing. But I don't know the solution to that, but that's worth thinking. That's a very good thought. definitely. And then, yes, I come from India and we have a similar culture. And this is another, like this particular last few weeks, India has been going through this pandemic. And I know some folks in my immediate family are also impacted by that. So I don't know the answer to that, but definitely in this day and age, we have to think about how we all can help each other instead of just pointing fingers at each other. So definitely that's worth a thought. So that's good. Now, moving on. So you have been there, done that in terms of your achievements. You have built 6 businesses. You have created your own venture fund. Now you are helping startups with SAP. What's next? Do you have a plan, or what's your goal in the next 3, 4, 5 years?
I always have plans when it comes to what's next. And, I think that there is so much opportunity to dive in and help with some of these societal issues that we've just been talking about. I find myself gravitating towards that more and more on a daily basis. And so I do think that over the next 3 to 5 years, I'll be tackling one of these problems with a business or a series of businesses to really combat this polarization, this loneliness. How do you bring back the community that, that we really should be having as fellow humans?
Yeah.
And I think also maybe as I get older, I think a lot about legacy. I think a lot about the world that we are leaving for the next generation. I can't just stand idly by and just do things for the sake of profit. It's really about doing things for the sake of purpose.
That's really inspiring. So before I conclude the interview, could you share any of your favorite books that you always go back for reading and you probably like to gift it to everyone, which drives your philosophy about life, about work? Any 1 or 2 books that you love?
Yeah, so one book I've read again and again is Tuesdays with Morrie. And so it's a beautiful, beautiful book. I mean, you're nodding, and so you're very familiar with it too. And I do always try to have that perspective. Like, what does life mean at the end of the day? So I think that it's a beautiful, beautiful book that I always recommend everyone to read. The second book I would recommend, this is a more recent one, and I really enjoyed it as well, is Clayton Christensen's How Will You Measure Your Life? And he was, of course, a very accomplished Harvard Business School professor. But what I really loved about the book was that he wrote it after knowing that he was battling the same cancer that his father also had and eventually succumbed to it. And, talked about what had made him go into the profession of education and the values that he kept. These are the types of questions that you should always be asking yourself. Not only what type of leader do you want to be, and how will you make that impact, but at the end of the day, how will you measure your life? Is it by, the richness of your relationships, about how you've held true to your values? It's important to have a North Star, which is why I think that book is really powerful as well.
I love it. I got some good nuggets of wisdom from you. So I'm definitely going to read this book. So for the folks who want to find you and reach out to you, what's the best way to find you?
Yes, so I'm on LinkedIn and also on Twitter, Vanessa W. Liu, Vanessa WLIU. So reach out to me. My DMs are open. And, I would love to see if I can be helpful in any way.
Cool. I really appreciate that, Vanessa. And I'm going to put all this in the show notes. I really thank you for your time, and you have good time with your family in France.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. If you would like to listen to the full episode, go to our YouTube channel or Apple iTunes or Spotify. Go there and search for the Superhuman Project and you will find us. In case you would like to contact us, please follow our LinkedIn page and send us a direct message. Until then, thank you.